Hello and welcome to Naked Neuroscience, the podcast dedicated to the most fascinating organ in the human body, our brains. I'm your host, James Titko from the Naked Scientists team. Coming up, how scientists have been given a window into the visual world of fruit flies. Then we hear about the most sophisticated sarcasm detector ever developed. Yeah, right. And writer David Robson imparts advice to help us avoid severing our relationships during upcoming political elections. Scientists in America have developed an AI model of the visual system of a male fruit fly, such that they can predict its behaviour when it is looking at a female. The ultimate goal for this branch of computational neuroscience is to understand more complex visual systems, like ours, in detail. A better grasp of our mind's eye could pave the way for treatments for blindness and help us build better artificial visual systems for self-driving cars. But that's easier said than done. While hardware has come on leaps and bounds, our visual system consists of billions of neurons, more than we can replicate inside a computer. That's why Ben Cowley from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is focusing on flies instead. Because of their streamlined visual system, he can model every brain cell involved in the process which turns visual inputs into social behaviors. And it's led to some pretty eye-catching findings.
It turns out that if you actually look at the anatomy of the fruit fly visual system, going from its retina, and if you look at maybe the 3 or 4 synapses away, the circuitry looks very similar to what we have in the early visual processing of the human visual system. So if we can understand these principles quite well in the fruit fly, it will apply to understanding the human visual system. But obviously, the fruit fly has maybe 800 little photoreceptors tiling the visual field, whereas humans have, in the retina alone, maybe 100 million neurons.
To do this, I imagine you need a window into the visual perspective of a fruit fly. How did you get one?
Well, it's a beautiful setup. They have a little ball that the fruit fly rests on, and then there's a projection screen around the ball that we can project visual stimuli on. And then the fly itself is head fixed, so that way we know where it's viewing. And then there's this microscope above this little fruit fly head that can peer and record neural activity that these neurons fire when particular stimuli are presented. As you can imagine, if a human was in that setup, just like a fruit fly, it's a very unnatural setup. The fruit fly sort of doesn't know what's going on, its head is fixed, and it's not really participating in any, let's say, behavior. So the difficult part is then we could view this fruit fly in a natural behavior, and one I'll describe is courtship, where this male chases the female, but we're unable to record from the neurons while the male is chasing the female. For obvious reasons, we can't move the microscope and things like that.
And how did you overcome that challenge?
Sure. Imagine all this visual information coming into this optic lobe. It's read out by, for the most part, 50 channels. And luckily for us, each channel is made up by only one cell type. And why that's really advantageous is that we can make a genetic line that targets that particular cell type. And we can just say with the genes, stop making this particular protein, silencing that particular neuron.
Okay, and by silencing a particular type of neuron, you're able to therefore see, when you put that fly into an experimental context, how its behavior changes based on what cells you've blocked from developing inside its brain.
Exactly. So for example, if we silence a particular cell type, and let's say that cell type, that channel encodes, for example, the female size, if we silence that, the male no longer has access to knowing how far the female is. And so his behavior is going to change. And the hope is our model can pick out when that behavior changes. So the data set looks something like this. We have a bunch of blind dates that we put these males and females through, roughly 500 different dates. And each date, there'll be a male that has some silenced cell type, and then we put it with a control female, so nothing's changed with the female. And then we just observe the behavior. We observe how this male tries to court or attract or pursue the female. we can infer then what the function is of that component.
It's extraordinary. And did it work?
Coming in, we were thinking probably maybe 3 or 4 of these channels, maybe 5 or 6 of these channels are going to contribute to courtship. But what we found through our model is the model is saying, no, actually, many of these channels, almost all of the channels, contribute to some type of behavior in courtship. And that was rather eye-opening. Apologize for the pun, but that was a little surprising to us because you have these discrete channels that it makes sense that each one contributes in a certain way. One is controlling or encoding female size, one is encoding female position, etc. But what we found instead is a population code. It's combinations of these channels are being reused in very different ways to perform complex behavior.
Fascinating, isn't it? But with the caveat that what you're saying is that this already complicated system is even more complicated than we really thought. And if the human visual system is orders of magnitude more complex, we're some way off being able to understand it to the granular level of detail.
I guess in hindsight, it should be unexpected, but yes, we're hoping most of these behaviors were reflexes, if you will, and each channel is like for one reflex. But it turns out, and maybe this is through evolution, or maybe back in the day, millions of years ago, the fruit fly was just all reflexes. But then as evolutionary and environmental constraints started to change and alter the behavior of the male and the female, they realized that they're stuck with the hardware, they're stuck with these 50 channels, but they could update the software, if you will. They can read out from these channels in very different ways to produce more and more complex behavior. So that's sort of where we're at right now. One thing we don't know in fruit fly vision is what they see during flight, because you can imagine that's really difficult. We can't have them fly around and record from the neural activity. So our approach is, in my mind, very exciting to be able to silence these different neurons and just let them fly around and see what the behavioral deficits there are. That will be really tantalizing to try to model.
Indeed. Will need to be seen to be believed. That was Ben Cowley from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory speaking to me there about his research published in Nature. The work was a collaboration with scientists at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. Now, as frequent users of current AI assistants know, Siri and Alexa can struggle to pick up on the double meanings we encode in our speech, and it can make for some pretty unnatural interactions. To work around this problem, Matt Kohler and Shekhar Nayak, researchers at the University of Groningen's Speech Technology Lab, used an innovative new method to train their new and improved sarcasm detector, feeding it heavily annotated clips from US sitcoms to capture the tone of voice and facial gestures of sarcastic asides, as well as the context in which they were deployed.
Sarcasm, like humor, irony, hyperbole, politeness, and so on, are what linguists call pragmatic phenomena. So they involve the use of language and context to express meaning that goes beyond the literal interpretation of the words. So a sentence like, "Oh, what a terrific party this is," and "what a terrific party this is," mean very different things uttered in different contexts, right?
Obviously, it's directly the opposite meaning to what we're saying. And I suppose that is a big reason why we're going to struggle when it comes to AI appreciation of this phenomenon.
It comes very naturally to us as humans, right? We're pretty good, although remarkably not perfect at understanding pragmatic phenomena like irony and sarcasm. And we recognize that this meaning is not always in the words, but in the melody of the words. It's not what you say, but how you say it. So we're trying to pioneer a more human-centered way of communicating with our machines, where humans don't adjust our language to the abilities of the machine, like we do usually now, but that the machines improve their ability to understand human discourse.
And when it comes to the challenges with helping artificial intelligence to pick up on sarcasm, and I'm coming to you here, Shekhar, how can you work to overcome them?
With AI, you need good data. It's not always explicit sarcasm. Even the tone may not change at certain moments of time. You have to take in the context, what was spoken earlier, what was spoken later. You can see the speaker's facial expressions.
Where do you look to find training data which might be able to synthesize all these different signposting effects into your model for it to learn from?
The most common data sets which we are using are TV shows, sitcoms, which have these videos, which also have like the audio modality, and the text is usually transcribed. Labeling is done. Human annotators listen to the audios and then mark it either sarcastic or non-sarcastic.
Interesting. So would it be fair to say that the strength of your model comes not necessarily from the vastness of the data set, but it's the specificity and the level of detail you've gone in annotating the training data you have used?
Fusion of information from different modalities, text, audio, and video. That's like the key.
And just a quick point, can I ask some examples of the types of TV shows? I know they weren't the only things you used in the training data, but what TV shows are we talking about here?
The TV sitcoms we used were Friends, Big Bang Theory, Silicon Valley, Golden Girls, and some others.
I mean, thinking about those sitcoms you're talking about and the uses of sarcasm from them, I can remember at least. Chandler Bing from Friends, for example, I'm thinking of most prominently. These are some of the most clear and obvious examples of sarcasm perhaps ever spoken in English. So are you confident that the model will hold up if the irony is perhaps a bit more subtle?
No. And I think that's a great point. So that, the headline is sarcasm detection works. But the fact is, this is acted sarcasm performed by professional actors and written by professional writers for comedic effect, right? So contrary to that, most of our sarcasm that we use has none of those features, right? I'm not an actor, and what I say off the cuff, sarcastically or not, on the fly, may or may not be meant to be interpreted even as sarcastic, and the ground truth is harder to derive. Nonetheless, the fact that the data set exists and is annotated in a scientifically rigorous way means that it provides really good and useful training data that we could use as a first step. And indeed, more work will be required to do this in a reliable way on the fly for fluent spoken sarcasm by you and me. But that's something that's on our radar already. First, we want to continue working on this and look at what aspects of the multimodal approach are the most meaningful to produce accurate sarcasm readings. So in other words, how little data is enough. And I think once that picture starts to come together, we'll proceed to expand our research to encompass also non-scripted, fluent sarcasm or uttered by ordinary people.
Notwithstanding those caveats, what else other than sarcasm might this training method be able to decipher for other sort of encoded meanings that humans use in their speech?
I think that's a really fun point. And that's one of the reasons that we're all very excited about the research is that since this works, it's a proof of concept on how we could expand to new avenues, including, for example, humor and irony, exaggeration, politeness, and others, many of which are really missing from our human device interactions. And so far, we've only been speaking about recognition, so the ability of the devices to recognize our intended meaning as speakers, but so too can we imagine working on synthesis. In other words, the ability of the devices to produce, for example, sarcastic, humorous, ironic text that be understood as such by human listeners. Taken together, this workflow allows us to expand to work on more natural human-machine interaction, but also to look at very small languages or very small data sets. This is a kind of proof of concept of working with very small data compared to other approaches. And that's also on our mind. Our faculty is located in the north of the Netherlands, where there's a small language, maybe under-resourced language called Frisian. And we intend to use some of these techniques to help improve speech recognition for Frisian and speech synthesis for Frisian as well.
Seems like a crafty way to watch TV shows all day and call it research, if you ask me. Many thanks to Matt Kohler and Shekhar Nayak from the University of Groningen.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
You're listening to Naked Neuroscience with me, James Titko. Why do we crave social connection? Why do certain people we're close to cause us stress? Why does politics seem to put our relationships under more strain than it seems like anything else? For the rest of the programme, I'm bringing you my conversation with the writer David Robson as we discuss the answers to these questions and more ahead of the release of his new book, The Laws of Connection. One thing I was really fascinated by in the book is the fact that as you might expect, our strongest social connections are the most beneficial for our well-being. But it's not necessarily our most antagonistic relationships or the people we're least keen on that are most detrimental to our well-being, is it? It's the ones in between.
Right. So obviously we try to keep the kind of really mean and nasty people to a minimum, but sometimes you can't avoid them. It could just be a colleague you really don't get on with. But those people are certainly not good for our health, but they're not as bad as the people who blow hot and cold. Those Jekyll and Hyde characters who might one day act like they're your best friend, and then the next day they might lash out because they feel jealous. This inconsistency is very stressful for us. There's this uncertainty to each interaction with those people. Because they're so nice to us, we really care about what they think. And so when they're hurtful, it's even more upsetting to us. So scientists call these ambivalent relationships. I think in everyday conversation, we might refer to them as frenemies. And what the research shows is that they do have a really negative impact on our health. So just knowing that you're going to have to interact with one of these people amplifies the stress that you're already feeling. And then we know that can have knock-on consequences for things like biological aging.
When social connections are going well, what do they look like? You touch on this idea in the book of a shared reality. I wonder if you could expand on that.
This particular part of the research really blew my mind because it just crystallized so much of what I felt personally made a good relationship. The shared reality is just that sense that someone is processing the world in the same way as you are. They see events in the same way. They have the same immediate emotional reactions. They're thinking the same things. So in our kind of everyday conversations, a really good sign of this is if you start finishing each other's sentences, or if you say the same thing at the same time. You both laugh at the same joke that maybe the rest of the group don't find funny. These moments happen quite frequently amongst friends, and the more they happen, the more frequent they are, the closer they feel to each other.
Do we have any understanding of underlying mechanisms going on inside the brain when, as you describe, we have these almost two minds becoming one?
We do, and that's what I love about this research so much, is that the metaphors we use are actually very accurate neurologically speaking. So, we talk about being on the same wavelength as someone, or like you said, like we feel we've got a kind of merged mind, a single stream of consciousness. And the research suggests that actually that is what's going on in the brain. You could take a group of graduate students and show them a string of different YouTube clips, so like a music video, a comedy clip, a documentary, something quite harrowing, all of these things. You could measure people's neural reactions to those events, like which areas are becoming active at which time. And just from those brain scans, the similarities in two people's brain activity turned out to predict how close they were within that group of students, like the degree of friendship within these people. So yeah, when we're friends with people, it is like our minds are actually working in sync, like we really are on the same wavelength.
While we're still on this topic, people might in the future be turning more and more to these parasocial relationships. Perhaps it might be a favourite YouTuber who they seek comfort in, or with the rise of artificial intelligence, a chatbot that can kind of mimic the effects of social connection. But I'm guessing with what you're saying, there's only so far that these relationships can really fulfill our need for social connection.
Yeah, I feel so. Parasocial relationships or technological alternatives can create the illusion of a friendship, and they can create that illusion of having a shared reality. But I think we're always going to be conscious of the distance between us and that celebrity or us and that technology. We're going to know that there fundamentally isn't this synchronous brain activity, and that they don't really understand us or get us in the way that we would crave from a real person sitting in the same room who is reacting totally spontaneously to the events around us in a way that we feel really seen and understood through that conversation.
Another way in which technology is shaping our social connections more and more is via social media. Observing other people's lives and reflecting on our own in comparison.
Absolutely. So there's just so much research showing that social comparison in all forms, even before social media came along, is pretty bad for our mental well-being. It can instantly destroy any happiness you would have from any particular achievement in your life if you immediately compare yourself to someone who has achieved even more. What I think social media does is it just makes that social comparison much easier. We're probably engaging in it much more than we had in the past. As long as we are on that treadmill, like trying to compete with other people, I think we are going to feel isolated ultimately. So there's this phenomenon with a beautiful name called the beautiful mess effect. And that essentially shows we tend to be very scared about revealing any kind of vulnerability because we think it will be perceived as being weak or embarrassing. We hold these things that we feel ashamed of as secrets, and that can leave us feeling more isolated because it stops us from having that shared reality, from knowing that other people have experienced the same things as us. But what the research shows is that when people do reveal their vulnerabilities, others' perceptions are often much more positive than they believe. So rather than seeing weakness, people might see courage. And actually just the whole act of self-disclosure is giving material to build that shared reality. So if we were just a bit more honest on our social media, we might find that we receive a lot more empathy from other people than we would expect and a lot more support.
When it comes to our social connections, it feels like very few things put them under as much strain as politics. What can you tell me about the cognitive biases maybe that lead to them being such flashpoints in our relationships?
Right, and I think this comes partly because we see our political beliefs as being this core part of our identity, and it is part of our worldview. So when we find that someone who we might agree with on lots of other issues and, really have that shared reality with, when we find that they don't share our political views, that can put that shared reality under stress. But actually, there are some biases that maybe lead us to be too pessimistic about the possibility of reaching mutual understanding. And so one of these is just that we have faulty assumptions about what the other person wants to achieve with these conversations. We assume that they want to just persuade us, to hit us over the heads with facts, and sometimes we think they just want to have an argument. What we don't understand is that actually, when you look at the research, most people genuinely do want to build an understanding. They're genuinely curious about what you think. We think their motives are maybe worse than they actually are. And what I love about the research is that then they've engineered these conversations between people who disagree, and they've encouraged them to just make their interest and curiosity explicit. So people actually, rather than just jumping to those assumptions, they actually say, I really care about what you believe and I want to hear more about it. And they found that immediately diffuses the landmine of the conversation. It just makes it a lot more constructive. And actually, when both parties are describing their curiosity in that way, each party is then more willing to kind of accept the own holes in their own arguments and to just be a bit more humble about their beliefs. So you can actually have real conversation where you can both exchange your views honestly, which allows you to repair that shared reality and to come to some kind of mutual understanding. Even if you don't agree, you can at least identify the points on which you do agree, and you can understand why you disagree on the others and recognize that it doesn't make the other person this terrible, evil human being for thinking the way they do.
David, just to say a big thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
And if you'd like to learn more, you can read David's book, The Laws of Connection. That's all for this episode of Naked Neuroscience. Join me again next time for more cutting-edge neuroscience made simple. For now, I've been James Titko. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.